Hey everybody, my name is Pete Chazant, and this is my first attempt at a video, so I don't have exactly prepared remarks. I mainly just kind of want to get some ground ideas down, and I can start by relating them to basically the tragedy that's going on in the news today. I actually just got um, a, a, a a group call at my company about race relations and racism, and and one of the things I brought to the table was just an article, a Time magazine article, which I'll link to in the bottom, um, stating Martin Luther King's views on racism, but on riots and a lot of different topics that are all related to that. And the one message I wanted to get across is whether it's racism or sexism or many other isms or what they call um, illnesses of the soul or illnesses of basically sicknesses that are related to poverty, when that's whether that's child abuse or spousal abuse or suicides or things of that nature, that they all have an economic tie that binds them together. So really all the isms that we kind of face in our society really have at their core an economic bond, such that if we gave a sense of security to people, that they weren't struggling against the world to make a living, and if they weren't constantly in fear that their jobs may be in jeopardy, or that they could lose their income at any minute, they could lose their health insurance, any of those things. If people felt more secure about their spot in life, there wouldn't be such phobias and racisms, and we know this from Rosie the Riveter, that there was resentment about women going into the workforce. Not so much at the time they did it because the men were off fighting the war, but when they came home, they were now competing with their wives and girlfriends and neighbors, um, for the very jobs that they felt that they deserved when they came home. Well, true, a veteran definitely deserves income, deserves to be taken care of, not coddled, but taken care of, making sure that the resources are available, that he has or she has the means to make that income, to be able to be self-sufficient. And when I argue with more conservative people, they don't really seem to understand that an unemployment rate, if there is an unemployment rate, whether it's 3% or 6% or 10% or whatever it is, that number physically represents that there is not enough jobs to satisfy all the people looking for jobs. I mean, that takes me to federal jobs guarantee, which I might argue for a little bit later. But I kind of want to just set the settings that all the social ills really in the world are due to economic issues. I mean, so when I hear that people are too lazy to find a job, that really, it burns me up, because there physically is not enough jobs to go around unless we make them. I mean, we could have full employment. We could have everybody who wants a job can have a job. And we also need to realize that a job is not the end all be all to a human's worth. That if we are constantly comparing our work to someone else's work, and it's hard to compare any of this stuff, because one may have more physical labor involved, one may be more higher education, and to be honest, the higher education, maybe it takes a certain kind of person to do that type of stuff, but they're not doing physical labor, they're not breaking their back, they're not really literally giving lives or years of their lives off in service of this job, just so that they are entitled to the resources of society. It's food, clothing, shelter, and their children being educated, and vacation once in a while, and healthcare, things that we take for granted. And we do take them for granted because a large portion of the world doesn't enjoy this. And another conservative talk about it here is well, the standard of living now is so much better than it was 50 years ago. And yes, that is true. The poorest among us are probably living better off than they did 50 years ago, but they're still, in a way, it's relative, so that even if you're not in the dangers of starving, and some people are, if you lose your house, you're in the danger of starving, that many have been 50 years ago. But the way our society is set up, if you're not able to get the latest gadgets, or at least a moderate version of the latest gadgets, that it's really hard to compete in the workforce if you're not able to. I think about it this way. I mean, yes, you don't have to have a cell phone, but if you were reliant on a landline, I mean, nowadays it's really just not practical to get around in life like that. So, so these arguments of, relative income and what's truly considered the poverty level and things of that nature are kind of bunk, because again, at any economic level that's below a certain point, you're struggling. There's a poverty economy, so you're struggling to maintain yourself in a competitive, employable workforce. And so if you don't have a modicum of these latest gadgets, you're falling behind. And so therefore, you're never really kind of getting a safe catching up to yourself so that you can even breathe, because you're always trying to improve yourself to the point where many people are driving themselves nuts. I have a bit of experience with this. I was in a lot of debt a bunch of years ago, and I was very fortunate to be able to get myself out of it. But what I call the poverty economy is that economy is meant to keep you there, because there are businesses making money off of the fact that you're too poor, whether it's what is it, the payday loans, and whether that your investment advisor does not always have to be a fiduciary, which means that they're not legally responsible for giving you the best interest that's in your best interest. They could be, giving you the stock portfolio picks that are in the best interest of their firm to be getting rid of. And we've seen how that's played out in the financial crisis. A lot of people were hurt very badly because they were left holding the bag for things that companies are just trying to get off their books. All right, so I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. I kind of rambled on, which I tend to do, but what I want to get to is kind of my evolution on what political thinking is. And I started out, I started out as just, I guess, what you'd probably call your raging liberal back in the 90s. I was 14 and the Iraq War had come out, and when I kind of realized that this war was really about oil and wasn't about giving anybody freedom or bringing democracy to anybody, and that we really didn't care if Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. It was just that he was a bad guy doing things that were against our interests. So it kind of woke me up to what politics, what our foreign policy is kind of based off of, and really what our economy is based off of. And so I believe in class warfare. I believe it exists. I believe that the upper echelons of society have set up our society in a way that it's very easy for them to maintain their status, and it's very hard for anybody to climb the ladder, to hoist themselves up by their own bootstraps. Because you know what? A lot of times there's just, again, with the unemployment rate, there's not enough bootstraps to go around. So they always like to, celebrate the statistically small amount of people that are able to climb out of their pits. But it's not, it could never happen for the mass majority. So as much as they would like to blame it as, your own failures, it's just statistically, math says that it couldn't happen for everybody. So that's what I want to stick to, is that the math says it can't happen for everybody, no matter how morally wonderful you are, no matter how wonderful your work ethic is the numbers physically don't work for everybody to be middle class, So that's where certain programs I like to begin with come in. Actually, I'll backtrack. So where I'd like to begin at this point is talking about, again, my evolution in politics. So it used to be, I believe in class warfare, and it used to be a 1-for-1 equation. If you wanted to do the federal spending necessary to take care of people, that you had to offset it somewhere else. So whether that was raising taxes on people who had the money, which is generally the wealthy, or whether that was cutting spending, which is defeating the purpose of really what you're trying to do in making sure that there's a very valid safety net for everybody. But as time came on, though, that equation started to change for me, mainly because, as we now know, whenever there's a war that's on the table, there's no problem getting money, and there's no issue. Everybody just votes for it. Boom. There's no questions asked. It's just done. But whenever it comes down to social spending, it comes down to, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to offset it? We can't do this. It's going to bankrupt us. You're going to turn into Venezuela. All these crazy, fear mongering things. And there's a couple of theories as to why that's the case. One is that the wealthy and the powerful very well believe that it does have to come from somewhere, and that they believe it's going to come out of their pockets, and that is kind of the old way of thinking. It really was a very much eat the rich kind of attitude for a long time, but we're now, I think, more in a spot. We've seen the evidence that we can just ignore the rich. We don't need to eat the rich. We can just go around them. That the federal spending, that we have much greater capacity to spend without fear of massive inflation than we ever thought possible. And there's two data points that go along with that. One, Japan's been at 250% federal deficit in comparison to their GDP for like 20 years now. So they have basically shown that you can do quite a significant amount of spending and it's not inflationary. In fact, Japan's been it's called stagflation, but basically that inflation's low, but demand really hasn't picked up. So let me backtrack. So I think what that means is where we can do the federal spending necessary to fill in the gaps of our economy, that we raise the standard of living for the lowest among us to a certain floor. I like to look at it as like the operating system on your phone. The operating system is generally free. You pay for the phone, but the operating system comes free. And you expect it to, because the apps that are built on top of that operating system are what is almost what sense of gives that operating system its worth. It's the apps that go on your Android phone that make it worthwhile to have the Android phone. So the richer the operating system that can support all those platforms or those apps, and the apps are what are generally making money, whether it's through advertisement or whatnot. And Google definitely makes its money in other areas, whether that's selling you storage space or things of that nature. So having a stable base operating system, which is what I'm going to call the government. The government is our base operating system. By having a very robust, where it's hard to fail. It may not be the easiest, to overwhelmingly exceed, but where it's very hard to fail. That's where people feel safe enough to then become actually entrepreneurial. Where if you have your education, we shouldn't be making people pay for education, because we want everybody to be as educated as possible. Now they gotta work it out for themselves and figure out how much education do they need in comparison to their timeline and where they're at. I get all of that, but those considerations should never be so detrimental that it means that if you don't follow the straight line to navigate that path, that all of a sudden you fall into a pit of poverty. Basically our healthcare costs, so many people have gone into bankruptcy just over a single illness. And we can talk about how street crime is tied to all that and things of that nature. So what's the old saying? Everybody does better when everybody does better. And that's true. So anyway, part of this comes down to, I guess I'll circle back and talk about modern monetary theory now. And what that essentially is that the government, or any government that, prints its own currency, is in control of its own currency, and their deficits are denominated within their own currency. So we're not borrowing in like euros, or we're not borrowing in, wands. We borrow money in dollars. And as such, we can pay for any debt that we have. We can always pay any debt that we have, regardless of the size. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no constraints on that. The constraints are always, do you have the physical resources available within your society to absorb that money? Because, like pushing on a string, you can only put so much money towards something before it starts to gather inflation, because it's, it physically can't be anymore. So if you're at if you have a factory that's running at 70%, you can pretty safely run that factory up to 95% efficiency or capacity rather, before you get to the point where you can't make it work anymore, because it doesn't have the labor, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the physical time on the machines available to do any more productivity. And that's when you start running into inflation, because that's when the government starts outbidding either themselves or the private sector has to outbid for that time on the machines or that productivity of the factory. And that kind of goes for anything. But you build a second factory, and all of a sudden you got twice the capacity. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to do as societies. So, like, I'll take Medicare for all. I love Medicare for all. I think that is absolutely the way we should go. A great example of this is, everybody thinks that by having a direct, let me clarify, it would be, the government wouldn't be the healthcare. So you'd still have private doctors, private hospitals. It's the government would be the single payer purchaser. So they would replace the insurance company, whose job is, basically to make sure that they pay you or pay out money for you as little as possible. That's what an insurance company has to do. That's how they make their money. So by eliminating the insurance company as a middleman and doing direct payments to the hospitals and doctors, and we can then be an incentive with their purchasing power, we can then incentivize wellness care as opposed to, on the spot detrimental care. Was it preventive medicine is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's exactly true in this case. So, and the other half of that equation is, doctors don't like Medicare because they don't pay enough. Well, sure enough, that's probably true, and it doesn't mean that Medicare wouldn't have to maybe up their prices to satisfy what the market demand for those hospitals and doctor services are. But at the same time, the government subsidizing the education to become a doctor, at some point you're going to put enough doctors into the system where the demand for their labor is going to even out. The cost of their labor will come down if you put more doctors into the system. So we pay for more people to become doctors. Doctor care becomes less expensive. And you build more hospitals. Hospital space becomes less expensive. You build more MRI machines. MRI machines become less expensive. Listen, I am a capitalist. I kind of look at it this way. I look at capitalism as the chewy center, and socialism as the chocolate nougat that covers the candy bar. And that it takes both of them to really keep that robust society. I mean, it is true that Russia did implode upon itself because it wasn't providing enough services and products that people really wanted. I had a high school teacher who he was a great guy. He would tell us, they took a trip to Russia, I think once a year, and he would always tell people, listen, bring extra pairs of jeans. He's like, go out and buy like 10 extra pairs of jeans. You'll be able to sell them in Moscow on the street for like $100 a piece, because American products were definitely worth more. They were valuable. But there's an equation, there's a formula that goes with all that. So, what we've done is we've had this free for all. We get any product and this and that, but what we've done is we've left Swiss cheese holes on the labor side of the equation. I mean, we can talk about Reagan firing the air traffic controller unions and busting up the unions, and that's a whole conversation unto itself, and that did great damage to the labor movement. But the point is you don't even need labor unions if you have a labor government, and the labor government needs to be filling in the employment holes instead of mandating, or instead of passing minimum wage laws by laws. The federal government can be managing or manipulating the minimum wage by having the federal jobs guarantee. They set the minimum price that they're going to pay their workers, and then the private sector has to match that. Otherwise, their employees are going to go work for the government. And there's so much work that needs to be done. I mean, you think about the Peace Corps, building the highways across America. I mean, there's a lot of infrastructure work that needs to be done. There's a lot of, if we were to get rid of Medicare for all, or if we were to get rid of the private insurance, there are a lot of people that'd be losing their jobs. But Medicare for all would need a lot of people to come on in and then manage those claims. So, I mean, a lot of the people coming from the insurance company sector would be able to be easily absorbed into the government sector to manage filling out the claims for Medicare recipients. And they can do it in such a way where there's job sharing. So, I mean, one of my goals would always be to, get down to the 30-hour work week. I mean, it's the last time that there's been a major improvement in the amount of hours that people have had to work was the 1930s? Is that when the 40-hour work week came around? I mean, how sad is that? I mean, you've heard the statistic that Americans haven't, had a raise in 40 years, and that's true. Adjusted for inflation, that our wages have been pretty much stagnant for about 40 years. The government's able to set the standard of what labor is. we could do that on a 30-hour work week basis. And again, the private sector then needs to adjust to that, because if the government's going to pay you better, and the government's guaranteeing anybody who wants a job from them can have one, then that by default manages the market. Now, I don't advocate that the government dominate the market. And I guess that's, the hyperbole that a lot of the conservative people would immediately jump to. It's the government filling in the holes where the private sector is not picking up the stick. Now, if the private sector wants to come in and say, listen, we're going to do all this, we can handle this and we can do it better. And the government says, okay, listen, everyone's feeling good. Everyone's been taken care of now for the last 20 years. And we feel that maybe this portion of the medical market is more open for competition. Maybe we'll be better served by more competition. I'm all for that. I'm all for what the moment calls for. But we've had 40 years of labor destruction. We've had pretty much ever since the 60s. It's been a downward slope since then. It didn't really hit. It didn't start to be fully enforced until the 80s. But it took another 20 years for people to realize that they weren't getting ahead and that their credit card bills were going up. Basically, what the government used to pay out, or what the companies also would pay it out, they stopped doing that, and they, moving their pensions over to 401ks, and it's not as profitable. It's not as lucrative, and because the government was tightening its belt, the private sector made up for it by putting more debt on their credit cards. And if you look at the numbers, it's true. American credit card debt went up significantly starting in the 80s. And when credit cards all of a sudden became very highly available, I mean, they would call that a market innovation, but it wound up putting all of America in some severe credit card debt in the next 30 years. So essentially what it comes down to is the federal government can spend what it needs to spend. It's not the number that's the issue. It's where are they putting the money? If they're going to be so you may be familiar with Andrew Yang and his universal basic income idea, which is kind of what I would call a subset of the modern monetary theory. It's one application. But the reason in normal times, I would advocate for a universal basic income now during quarantine, because we want people to stay home. We want to pay people to stay home because that's what's going to get us over the virus that much sooner. And we will come out healthier on the back end. The economy will come out healthier on the back end if we do that. But in normal times, I wouldn't argue for a universal basic income. I would argue for a federal jobs guarantee, because the federal jobs guarantee just fills in the gaps where they need to be filled. The universal basic income just gives everybody whatever set amount that they're set doing. And I would argue if you're going to do it, you got to do it for everybody, regardless of whether they're rich. And I know people I don't want to give rich people money, but you know what? The amount of people that are rich people getting that money is so small in comparison to how that much it would help everybody else. It's not worth making that argument, because you start drawing lines like that, all of a sudden you're getting into a legislative battle, and then people are picking sides, and that's when your legislation dies. All right, I'm going to kind of wrap it up here. It's enough for the first time. What you may notice behind me is something specific to New Jersey, but I want everybody to see it. It's our flow chart for how New Jersey politics works. You have the National Democratic Committee, DNC. We also have a state committee, and then each county has their county committee, and then it breaks down and you have your local town clubs. So what I was first taught about in about 2016, when Bernie started coming on the scene, was basically how the power structure, at least in New Jersey, is. It's different in other states, so you would have to adapt this model to however your state's set up, but there's a lot of similarities going on. But a lot of power is concentrated in the county committee, because it's the county committee that decides who gets the ballot line, who gets to be on the same line as whoever's running for president that year, or whatever popular senator is running that year. It's the county committee that decides who's on the same line as that popular person. And then because everybody else is running, you got 3 people running for Congress, one person gets to be on the same line as a person running for president, and then the other 2 people are on the line below. And you know what? Most people, when they vote, they just vote down the line. And they know that's the point. So behind me was the idea of Occupy Democrats. you can't sit there and complain about the system and not be involved in it. And I know people think about not voting or not partaking in the system. Is their vote? There's a little bit of truth to that. I mean, yes, they do look at numbers of people who didn't vote and say, "Oh, the amount of apathy is is outstanding. That must mean something." But you know what? It doesn't matter. They don't care if you're not in the system. If you're not in the club with them, with a vote, then it doesn't matter. They're going to walk all over you. They would rather the status quo than anything change. The establishment Democrats would rather lose and let a Republican be in charge than to have a Bernie Sanders who they feel is going to take everything away from them. And Bernie would take some power away from them, but I will reject any notion that Bernie is going to take away all of the billionaires' money. He's not. The way he would do it, maybe he would tax the rich a bit more, but they'll be just fine. They're not all of a sudden becoming broke. They're not all of a sudden becoming power. But I would argue, and this is where I even differ from what Bernie publicly says, and I say that because Bernie's economic advisor is the woman that I admire most. In fact, if anybody I wish was president, it would be her, and that's Stephanie Kelton. She's one of the founding parents, I'll say, of modern monetary theory, whose message is, you can feel confident and safe about the government spending money. This whole thing about that we've taken out a credit card to the Bank of China is nonsense. China owns, it may be less now. Last time I knew, they held like 6% of U.S. Treasuries, which is not an insignificant amount, but the Federal Reserve owns like 90% of U.S. Treasuries. So our U.S. Treasury system is very safe, mostly in the hands of our own Federal Reserve. All right. Thank you very much. I'll be doing more of these. And I know this was a rambling stream of consciousness. I kind of tend to work that way. Hopefully I'll be able to edit this into a more coherent thing, or maybe as I get going with this, I'll be able to stick to topics a little bit better. But I guess what do they say? Like and subscribe, do something like that, and you'll hear from me more. Thank you. Bye-bye.